work on such issues as protecting and sustaining Maine's working waterfronts, advancing electric outboards for Maine's commercial fleet, and expanding aquaculture in Maine. Sam was born in Damariscotta, raised on the shores of the Pemaquid Peninsula. He's a trained anthropologist and climate scientist fascinated by how individuals and communities adapt to changing social and environmental circumstances. He previously directed the Herring Gut Learning Center in Port Clyde and managed a lobster wharf and seafood processing facility. Having earned MS and MA degrees from the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute and Department of Anthropology, Sam is studying there for a PhD in anthropology and environmental policy. He lives with his family in Damariscotta. Would you give Sam a warm welcome?
Well, thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you, Cliff, and thank you, members of the Rotary, for opening your doors to me today. I'm thrilled to share a little bit about our future of fishing area of work, which is the fourth area of work that I oversee in our Center for the Marine Economy at the Island Institute. This work was spurred on by a congressionally directed spending award that we received at the behest of Senator Collins and Senator King. And really that award serves as a catalyst for what we're really anticipating to be a long-term area of work to support Maine's fishing communities as they grapple with the numerous challenges that are coming down.
Sam, my apologies.
That's okay. So I can kind of fly through a little bit of a background. Bruce did a great job of laying out kind of where I'm from and who I am. I will just say my passion has always been those that make their living on the water and how to support them through changing times. And I'm thrilled to be able to be at the Island Institute, where we boldly navigate climate and economic change with island and coastal communities to deliver solutions and expand opportunities. And it really gives me a home to bring together all of the pieces of my work and all of my vast experience into one place. So I can keep going while this is getting set up. Yep, everyone is aware of the important role that Maine lobster plays in our coasts and islands. For the last 100 years or so, it has been one of the major economic drivers of the coast, more so since the mid-1990s. If we look at the diverse kind of setup of our marine economy, in the 1990s, we had a fairly evenly shaped pie spread between lobster, sea urchins, ground fish, and a variety, and softshell clams, and a variety of other species. Over the last 30 years, we've seen a concentration in reliance on lobstering in island and coastal communities. And this has both brought significant benefit, but also significant risk to these communities. In essence, all of our eggs are in one basket. And should anything happen to disrupt the lobster fishery, that is going to have far more significant ripple effects into communities than, it's the second one up, Camden Rotary. Yeah, that one right there.
We're on our way.
That's all right. I can. The slides are helpful, but happy to do this. So just a couple. Just a couple statistics to kind of support the overall economic reliance. Last year, Maine lobstermen landed around $464 million in direct ex-vessel value. This is down from a high of almost $800 million several years ago, but is generally representative of how much primary economic driver the lobster plays in these coastal communities. That roughly $500 million in value supported over 4,800 sole proprietors, 4,800 individual businesses, individual fishermen scattered between Kittery and Eastport. Great.
A little confusion, Sam, from
No, that's all right. No apologies are necessary. So you heard about the Island Institute, our mission and vision, who I was. So here we are, and here just to highlight again, this is our pie in 1995 for our state's landings. Lobster and sea urchins were tied for the two most profitable species. This is 2015. We see a sole reliance of our marine economy on lobster. And you can imagine the risk that this plays. Lobster fishery is not just a statewide economic driver, it is often the sole primary economic driver for many of our down east communities. They are the true definition of fishing communities, and fishermen and the economic activity that they bring forward in their communities supports the local banks, local stores and markets, local car and truck dealerships. But fishermen also wear many hats within these communities, often serving on select boards as EMTs. So anything that happens to this primary economic driver has huge ripple effects. And as one island grocer says, what goes on out there, meaning on the water, goes on in here in the store. Anything that happens on the water or in relation to the fishery has ripple effects throughout the community. So to take a step back and talk a little bit about some of the things that are afoot in the Gulf of Maine right now. The two primary drivers of ocean conditions in the Gulf of Maine, this region between Cape Cod and Halifax, Nova Scotia, are the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current. The Labrador Current is caused by cold meltwater coming down from the Arctic, and the Gulf Stream from warm water coming up through from up the equator. So we can see, historically, at least in the early 2000s, the Gulf Stream was farther away from the Gulf of Maine than it has been in the past. In 2010, we saw what ecologists call a regime shift happen. And this is caused by the Gulf Stream shifting its course due to less Arctic meltwater coming down. So the warmer water was able to come inshore and come into the Gulf of Maine more regularly and to a greater degree than it has in several thousand years. And because of this, the Gulf of Maine, for a brief period of time, was warming faster than 99.9% of the world's oceans. It's still in the top 95th percentile, but a few other places have surpassed it in most recent years. And you can imagine that for a species like lobster, who is driven primarily on its annual cycle by water temperature, tells it when to molt, tells it when to come inshore to reproduce, this is going to have ripple effects. So you can see this is the biomass of the American lobster on the East Coast from Jacksonville, North Carolina, all the way through the Gulf of Maine in the 1970s. Things were much colder then. This is the biomass per tow, and this is the Maine State Lobster, Maine DMR's lobster tow. They do a federal tow survey where they go and they drag for lobster and document how abundant they are. This is 2019, and you can see not just the changing distribution, but the changing intensity of lobster landings. Lobsters have really benefited from an increased ecological range in the Gulf of Maine. There are not only more lobsters here than in other places, but there are more lobsters here in general. So just to put this in perspective, the average catch prior to the mid-1990s for the Maine lobster fishery was around 20 to 25 million pounds. For the last decade, we've been in excess of 100 million pounds, with a high of roughly 130 million pounds. So we're talking exponential increase in the availability of the resource, coupled with an increased reliance on that species. These warm temperatures are also, unfortunately, potentially reaching a point where they're starting to have more negative impacts, in particular in southern Maine. So apologies for all the graphs. Can sum up what these are indicating. These are a list of all of the different programs that the Maine Department of Marine Resources runs to assess the status of the lobster resource. So they look at sea sampling, where DMR scientists will go out with fishermen and keep track and monitor and measure the lobsters that they're catching. The trawl, we saw the trawl survey results, where they go out and drag for lobsters in a systematic fashion. They also work with fishermen to use ventless traps that don't allow small lobsters to escape, so they can assess the kind of population dynamics. All of these are showing downward declines in every region and across the board to varying or lesser degrees. What this means is that these are the measures of juvenile lobsters in general. And it takes roughly 7 years for a lobster to hatch, molt enough times to reach catchable size. And if we're seeing declines in juvenile lobsters, that has the potential impact that we're going to see declines in large catchable lobsters down the road. And in kind of mirroring this trend for the last 2 years, we have in fact been below 100 million pounds for the first time in roughly 15 years. So some of the catch is actually mapping some of these predicted declines in lobster. Lobster isn't the only thing that's being impacted directly by this. So this regime shift that happened in 2010 also changed the distribution of a really key species in the Gulf of Maine, a little copepod, a little animal plankton called Calanus finmarchicus. This is the base of the food chain. Juvenile lobsters eat it, herring eat it, right whales eat it. And because the changing distribution of Calanus went from the Gulf of Maine, really the Bay of Fundy was the primary hotbed of this, where right whales would come and feed on an annual basis after calving down in the southern states. The concentration shifted from the Gulf of Maine to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. As a result of this, right whales started showing up in a place that they hadn't showed up before. As a result, the fishing practices, in particular of the Canadian snow crab fishery, weren't prepared to deal with mammal entanglement. And as a result, there was a massive mortality event where 17 endangered right whales passed away in the span of a year, most caught in Canadian Arctic fishing gear. Fishing gear entanglement and ship strikes, the two primary causes of death for right whales along the east, or North Atlantic right whales across the East Coast. Up until last year, there had never been a documented entanglement in Maine lobster gear. That unfortunately was no longer the case after last year. There was a non-lethal entanglement of a right whale. But because of this mass mortality event, it triggered some things happening at the federal level. So the right whale is protected by two major pieces of legislation. First, the Endangered Species Act. And the second is the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Both of these acts require significant management of endangered species. And because the right whale is estimated to be just over 400 individuals, they are not just endangered, but critically endangered. So any changes to their population has the potential to trigger significant management interventions at the federal level. As a result of this, every year, NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service do what is called a biological opinion, where they assess the population of endangered species and make management recommendations. So right now, we're kind of in the tail end of, thanks to what fishermen are calling the Christmas miracle a couple years ago, where our senators intervened and delayed the onset of significant regulations, which would have drastically increased the number of closed areas closed to fishing seasonally or year-round, imparted significant trap reductions and line reductions. And line reductions just means the number of vertical lines that are attached to buoys in the Gulf of Maine. So in order to deal with this mortality event and the ramifications, what is proposed to happen is that the Maine fishery, and actually all fixed gear fisheries, so this includes Maine lobster fishermen, but also gill netters and things like that, they have to reduce their risk to right whales by 95%, which is a pretty significant percent. Some of the proposed recommendations that the Maine Lobstermen's Association was putting forward towards reducing the number of traps a fisherman could fish, and also consolidating end lines or trawling up, fishing more traps on a single line, would only get us to roughly 80–85% risk reduction. And the proposed management measures that would get us that last 10 to 15% were pretty significant. Seasonal closures in Zone G, which is the farthest down east, or Zone A in the farthest down east zone, year-round to shore. So functionally no fishing with roped gear for entire lobster zones. Many flaws in some of these challenges, like fishing, right whales don't necessarily interact in inshore waters, but in order to reach the risk reduction that is calculated through some of these models, practices like that were on the table. We have a respite into that. Noah and nymphs are wrapping up their second biological opinion. We've had some whale births, so we're not sure exactly how the calculus is going to change. But in the next 2 or 3 years, we will have the next set of recommendations for management measures, and it's really hard, barring discovering several hundred right whales out there, to think that some of the proposed management strategies are going to be less severe than seasonal closures, significant trap reductions, and things like that. But I do think it's important to note that there is this strong climate signal driving this decline of right whales. It is really all tracked back to that distribution of Calanus and the changing foundational food source. So while gear entanglement and ship strikes do play a role, there's a reason why these things are happening more often and in new places, and that's driven by the changes that we're seeing in the Gulf of Maine. So here, just a brief snapshot of the challenges that you face every morning when you wake up as a Maine lobster fisherman. So you have potential for significant regulations fundamentally changing the way you run your business. You have the uncertainty of warming and what that does to the Gulf of Maine and to the lobster resource. You have broader economic impacts. This is a global commodity traded out of Maine to the world. So disruptions in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in China in particular, have huge ramifications on the price of lobster and therefore the overall economy. And then last year really brought home the potential for significant environmental impacts. The January storms last year devastated the coastal infrastructure, which is the foundation of the lobster fishery. Wharves up and down the coast were destroyed, many beyond repair. And without that ability to go fishing, without that critical connection between the ocean and the economy, it is hard to make a living off the water. So we've long recognized that the coastal economy is in a somewhat precarious position, in particular in fishing communities that are really reliant on the lobster fishery. So whether it's regulation, whether it's environmental change, whether it's global economic change, we wanted to take an approach at the Island Institute that could really address the fundamental kind of business component of the lobster fishery. And I don't know how many of you are or know commercial fishermen, but as one myself and the third of 4 generations in my family to have held a commercial lobster license, we don't often run our businesses like a business. Profit and loss isn't necessarily something we calculate on a day-to-day basis. We go, we catch, we get paid, we pay our bills. Addressing that kind of foundational business approach is a critical component to anything that needs to happen within the fishery. So this is one of the things from foundational business support through a broad spectrum of support to workforce training. And this can range from fishermen that we've seen in recent years expanding their businesses into growing kelp in the off-season as a diversification strategy. Several others have become retrained in other skills that they can use to supplement their income in their off-season. So there's a whole gamut of support that sits in between here, and really trying to figure out what is best for each fishing family and really what is best for each community is part of our ongoing work here. And ultimately, by addressing some of these things, we're really focused on creating a more resilient and adaptable marine economy for islands and coasts. We know change is coming to the lobster fishery. How can we help folks weather that and keep as many folks fishing and making a living on the water? Because in so many of these communities, it is the fundamental kind of cultural definition of their communities as a fishing community. So we'll start here briefly, and this is a very busy slide, but the reason this is busy is because our Workforce Pathways team has spent decades developing a networked approach with organizations that are providing workforce pathways, workforce career training work. So collaborating across the coast with regional planning commissions, with organizations like Sunrise County Economic Commission in Washington, to really have these folks and help these folks understand the real challenges that are facing lobstering families and to help tailor their programs to benefit a sector that they may not have paid as much attention to. And really, to sum up our general approach towards all of this work, Maine has a lot of great programs and a lot of great organizations that are providing them. How do we weave them all together, make them more aware of the challenges that the Maine lobster fishery is facing, and have them recognize how their programs can be beneficial to these communities? So organizations like Project Launch in Stonington, Rural Aspirations Project, are also helping getting younger folks who may only see a career pathway in lobsters to look at other doors and other opportunities that they could be pursuing. So as you can see here, we have various tools in our toolkit. In addition to building these networks, we also provide Compass grants for folks that are interested in retraining. These are usually intended to support earlier career folks, younger folks in exploring career pathways. But we recognize that the generation that's going to feel this economic impact the most is probably the future generation of fishermen who don't have the opportunity to go and make a meaningful living on the water in the same way that their fathers, grandfathers, mothers, aunts, and uncles have had a chance to do. And we also recognize from our broadband work that each community is different. Each community needs to be met in a different place to help have these conversations. So our community broadband engagement process, it's represented as a wheel because you can really enter it at any point depending on where a community is. And we've developed and refined this for lobstering communities as well to help figure out how every community can engage in thinking about the changes to come so they can start to put in place the practices and the processes to move forward in a way that makes sense for their community. So two places in particular are really coming to the fore when we talk about communities that are proactively thinking about everything that's happening in their community and how it can benefit lobstering families. So we have Deer Isle and St. George are two places that have recently received Maine Connectivity Authority Awards for what are called connectivity hubs. And while these are connected to our broadband work of increasing digital access for communities, they're intended to support communities in bringing together all of their resources, whether it's telemedicine, whether it's first responders, whether it's workforce training, whether it's business support, into one area in conjunction with the towns, the municipal governments, and other organizations and communities, so they can really think holistically about what they need to build as a community, what their economic plan needs to look like in order to take into account some of these changes that they see on the horizon. And these are really prime examples where you can see that it is the local leadership and the ability to think ahead. Kathleen Billings, the town manager in Stonington, has probably one of the longest time horizons in her thinking of anyone I've ever met. She's an absolute force of nature and is thinking about how to position her community now for changes that will come in 10, 15, 20 years. So these are two areas where we're really hoping that we're going to be able to work very deeply with communities so we can identify many different doorways that they've opened that other communities could start to explore. Not all communities are ready for this level of engagement, but many are just seeking that opportunity of identifying where do we start? How do we have these conversations initially? How do we start thinking about some of these changes and what they mean? So for our business support, so we're going all the way on the other side of the spectrum now, away from the kind of deep place-based work of the connectivity hubs and the workforce training, to think about what business support entities exist in the state that provide the broadest level of support irrespective of the business that you're in, whether you're a lobsterman, a farmer, a mechanic, an HVAC person. So starting with the widest net, our small business development corporations, the Maine Technology Institute, and the Maine Center for Entrepreneurs all have amazing programs. In particular, the SBDCs have developed a Farms of the Future program that we're collaborating with them on now to turn into a Fishing of the Future program, to learn how we can leverage that good work that they've done with farmers in Maine to benefit fishing communities. And then once we have these broader supports in place and all of the trainings that they are offering over the next several weeks and months, we can move down to the more niche organizations like the Finance Authority of Maine, Coastal Enterprises Incorporated, which is a community development financial institution, making kind of philanthropically backed investments in a way that banks can't often do, the Maine Development Foundation, the recent C-Maine group, I'm not sure if folks are as familiar with this, the U.S., the Department of Economic and Community Development worked to get a significant investment of federal money to set up a seafood advisory council, in essence, to help think through what the needs are for seafood writ large in Maine, to help kind of bolster this and the role that lobster plays in it. And then we have regional and technically specific organizations. I mentioned Sunrise County Economic Council in Washington County. We're working deeply with them to extend some of their fishing retraining and fishing family diversification work. The Maine Aquaculture Association. Aquaculture isn't a panacea for some of these problems, but it may make sense for certain fishing families who want to keep working on the water to engage in. And Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center is doing just that in conjunction with Sunrise County and the Washington County Community Colleges in Down East Maine right now. So here you can see our general breakdown of our partner organizations that we're working with on this broad future of fishing work. Many of these, so yeah, Sunrise County, Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center is working in various places, Maine Center for Entrepreneurs, and here I'm blocking the Small Business Development Course. But we're currently working to put together programming and meetings in all of these locations to bring fishing families and fishermen together, to start to understand what resources they have available, what organizations are there to support them, and then how we can better tailor those existing programs to meet the ever-changing complex needs of a fishery that is facing so many challenges. To guide this work, one of my colleagues always said that the smartest person in a room is always the room. So we know that we don't have all of the answers, and we wanted to work with aquaculturists, with lobstermen, with town managers from across the coast to help us understand both how our work is matching up with the needs that they're hearing in the community, but also what we need to be designing for. Many of these folks have played various leadership roles in things like the Maine Lobstermen's Association. Many have diversified into aquaculture. Josh and Shay out in Islesboro have an extensive mussel farm that they run. And really, these are the folks that are keeping us honest and keeping our feet to the fire to make sure that what we're doing isn't an academic pursuit, but is actually resulting in real-world applications for the work to benefit the folks that live in these communities and people that are making their living on the water. So we're really just at the beginning of this phase right now. Our official launch of our programming is going to happen at the Fishermen's Forum this year. We have a session on the future of fishing where we're bringing together many of the organizations that you've seen listed here to develop programming, to deliver programming over a series of trainings and webinars coming forward. So you're catching us at the beginning of what is both a daunting because of the scale, but also exciting because of the number of partners that are willing to engage in this work, series of programming for us at the Island Institute. So I hope at some time in the future I could come back and present some of the successes that we've seen as a result of this work 12, 18 months down the road. But until then, just to show you what we're working towards, we're really trying to seek changes in society and the systems. We want to make sure that our islands and coastal communities have a more diverse marine economy so that people can continue to live and work in these communities in a way that matches their cultural description of themselves and their communities. And we need to work at the community level, but also with individual fishing families to help them demonstrate what can be done. So with that, happy to entertain any questions. I know it was a lot. I think I saw back there, then we'll get to you, Bruce.
I'm curious, are there any species that will actually perhaps benefit from the climate change?
So yes, it's just a matter of timing. So for example, back in 2012 when we had an anomalously warm kind of spring and winter, we saw an influx of longfin squid and black sea bass and to a lesser extent blue crab, all of which are incredibly valuable commercial species in southern states. The challenge is balancing access to these species with their management. So as waters warm and as ecology shifts, these species need to have a chance to get a foothold and maintain their populations before they are overexploited, because we don't want to see another boom and bust fishery like we did with the urchin fishery back in the 90s, where we caught everything and then it crashed, and we're dealing with some of the ecological ramifications there. So yes, there are going to be winners, and thinking about the ability of many down east folks to explore growing oysters, either in existing lobster pounds or in other leases, that is a door that can be opened. Traditionally, the waters were too cold to make it economically viable. It just took too long to grow the oysters. But we're seeing that doorway opening up down east in particular. Yes, Bruce.
Sam, excuse me, great presentation, highly interesting. I was sitting here thinking, well, how can Rotary clubs, and there are many in the state of Maine, fit into this picture? One thing that occurred to me that I wanted to ask you about, most of these clubs do have funds for scholarships. And I saw training on at least a couple of your slides. Is there a connection? Can Rotary clubs help in that picture?
Absolutely. Organizations like Rotary clubs have such deep community connections and know not just what assets exist, but often like where some of the sticking points are in communities and who might benefit most deeply. So I would hope that this presentation is like one of our doors opening to working with Rotary clubs to both let us know what you're hearing about needs, but also what we can do to support your existing programming. And part of our award is to support existing work within organizations and finding those partnerships with those deep community connections like Rotary that can also help deliver programs, but can also help work with us to set up meetings with some of these broader organizations in a way that is accessible to the community, I think is a real opportunity.
Clark.
Thank you. Your presentation
Yep, it's on.
was very thought-provoking. I am curious. Rotary is apolitical, but as we see, the political winds change in the United States, and it seems like they're swinging further and further each time, from the left to the right, to the left to the right. During the previous Trump administration, there was a great deal of financial support for the fishing industry, and there was an easing of regulations. During the Biden administration, I don't know what happened to the financial support, but I know some regulations were reinstated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious as to what you see happening in the next 4 years.
I think it is safe to say that we will probably see increasing deregulation across every single federal agency over the next 4 years. How that will play out in NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service in relation to the right whale regulations, it is anyone's guess. But there is a likelihood, a potential path where we're not faced with the same level of right whale regulations and the same level of regulatory impact on the fishery. But despite that, waiting in the wings are all of the changes that are happening in the Gulf of Maine. And whether you believe they're driven by anthropogenic climate change or simple natural variations, like things are changing, and that is going to change the resource that people are reliant on. So whether it's regulations in 3 years or warming waters in 5 to 10 years, the same approach kind of stands. We're overly reliant on a single species, and while it's doing well now, we're starting to see signs of decline, and we need to be prepared for how we address this kind of fishing family, fishing community resilience, agnostic of regulations and the impacts that regulations are going to have.
Clark, can you pass that to Mike?
I've been around this forever. 11 generations, Matinicus, Vinyl Haven, North Haven. I've seen the ins and outs, and it's kind of interesting to listen to this because I don't think the folks here may really realize how complex this is with small groups of people and small communities being challenged to tell the truth, be fair. Will it build good friendships and betterment and stuff like that? This has really been very difficult. And there's been some things here in your presentation that is kind of interesting, because a lot of the science data and stuff I always see based per trap. So years ago I asked, hey, does anybody really know the DMR, how many traps are actually being fished?
Yeah, there's a huge challenge.
You know, it's like, well, then if no one knows how many traps are actually being fished, how does the science data, how does that reflect on all the science data? That's just one example. Another one is a challenge that you're well aware of is somebody tried to bring up the whole idea of not only climate change, but suspended microplastics in the water. And now there are these initiatives to go clean up all the gear and stuff around these islands. And I've seen it, participated in it. And it's so, okay, climate change, all right, but how about if we really start talking to maybe the fishermen and say, you know, and I experienced this, and challenged the folks at the time in the DMR and other places about starting to support this fishing industry from an economic perspective. And they said, all right. And they started doing it, and they helped, and they grew the industry. And now you hear numbers like 400 and some odd $1 million, I heard, up to $1.6 billion of total industry wealth to the state of Maine. And I go, all right, that's cool, but now we got these other problems. Now, how are we going to shift gears to get the folks themselves, the fishermen, to say, yeah, you know what, we got to cut back from 800 traps down to 600. And one of the questions is, I wonder if the microplastics are interfering with the food chain that might be might be limiting the copepods, not the climate change, the suspended microplastics from all the gear that's in the water. And I know this because I fished myself, and I want the truth, and that's why I'm, you know, I say, all right, the Island Institute, all right, let's, you know, how are you getting your truth, and what are you dealing with? And I thought maybe kind of tough to share in this group today, and you know, in trying to have some fun and pleasantry, but I know that there's some serious issues there, and somebody's got to try to figure out how to deal with the mental thinking processes of these independent fishermen. It's time.
Yeah, it is. I like it. No, I mean, you touch on the absolute complexity of this situation. I mean, whether all of the different changes, different ocean uses, microplastics, warming waters, things like that, terrestrial runoff, all of this impact the Gulf of Maine in a variety of ways. But I think you just hit on in your last comment, the fundamental issue is change is really hard for humans. And when you're talking about dealing with change and doing things in a different way for the betterment, in many cases, of the fishery and for individuals, it is a journey to bring people along that. And it's even doubly more challenging when you take into account the level of stress and uncertainty that these fishermen and their families are undergoing on a daily basis when they're faced with declining catches, potential regulations, damage to their family peers and things like that. That mental stress, you cannot undersell that. So I'm thrilled that there are organizations like Maine Coast Fishermen's Association working to address that issue. So I know I don't want to cut conversations short. I'm happy to have follow-up, but I know you have some more business you need to attend to. Okay.
Do I get the last word? Okay. No, I just wanted to comment. I think that in many of industries across the United States that have hit various problems, some environmental, some not, some economic, some related to automation, some related to globalization, there's been, I think, really a series of failures on the government's part to deal with this. And I take heart in seeing this, that, you know, there's this kind of effort that I take it there's significant government money in this, but there's also other players in this. So more power to you.
We're doing our best, and like I said, I hope we'll have more successes to report in the future. But it's no easy road. So appreciate the invitation to keep the conversation going with Rotary and figure out how Rotaries can play a key role.